Hello and welcome. I'm Leanne Gerrans and you're watching W News Extra, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya studios. These are our top stories. Israel approves a plan to conquer Gaza City just days after Hamas agreed to a new ceasefire proposal. Meanwhile, Russia's Lavrov warns that security talks on Ukraine without Moscow are a road to nowhere as European leaders meet to discuss the war. And forming a new ICE detention center in Nebraska to the White House joining TikTok. We'll discuss everything happening in the US today. Now, Israel's defense minister has approved a plan to seize Gaza City and authorize the call-up of 60,000 reservists to carry out the plan. The move comes just 2 days after Hamas agreed to a new ceasefire proposal now under review by Israel. Qatar and Egypt say the plan is nearly identical to one Israel previously accepted, but Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu still hasn't responded. To discuss this and all of today's stories, I'm joined by Dubai 92 presenter Jono Haynes and also business editor of Gulf Arabian Business Insight, Shane McGinley. Thank you so much for both joining me this evening. So, Jono, let's actually start with you, because I think that we're at the stage now where Hamas accepted the ceasefire proposal. We know that. And Israel just seems to be ramping up its military operations, but hasn't actually said if it's going to accept the ceasefire proposal too.
No. And this is unusual. We normally have something from Netanyahu in a quick turnaround time where you think, we know what's happening, we know what's on his mind, and we know what he's thinking. The opposite of a wind down is what we're seeing. 60,000 reservist troops who are being rounded up in order to go to Gaza, which is a concern because that would indicate that there is going to be an on-ground military presence and that a ceasefire is no closer. However, Israel stands by its word once again. And Netanyahu has said that until the entire release of all of the held captives has been conducted, that there will be no removal of this plan to go on the on-ground offensive. So he's still keeping true to that. There are some opinion pieces which indicate that 60,000 reservists on the ground may be somewhat of a show of power to say Israel is willing to go in on the ground. If this happens, Hamas will be decimated. And if that's the case, then the war is lost for Gaza. And I think that that may be what we're seeing here right now, because if you're going to send in that level of troops, I don't know if you're going to necessarily send in reservists, first and foremost. I think you might be calling up your actual troops to go in to do this. But it may force Hamas to take the action that Israel wants, which is to release the hostages, which is the big key issue which has been unwavering so far. And regardless of the fact that we've heard the details of a prisoner exchange, which of course is amazing if we have a prisoner exchange and a hostage exchange, that's great news, but that still stops short of what Israel says that it wants.
So it's really interesting because I was speaking to a journalist earlier from Tel Aviv, and we were talking exactly about what you were talking about. It's the hostages, and most of the hostages, they believe, are within Gaza City, which is, of course, densely populated because people within Gaza have had to move, and the stronghold of Hamas is also Gaza City. But the problem, I think, and the big question is, people in Israel, and especially the families of the hostages, are really against this move happening because, Shane, they believe that the hostages will never come home once Israel takes the step forward to occupy Gaza City.
Yeah, and it's a strange policy. As you said, I think when we were talking earlier, there's maybe like between, maybe 50 hostages that are remaining. But if you send these 60,000, what are relatively probably like young men and women in, then you're going to probably have hundreds of more Israeli casualties that are going to be coming back as a result of this conflict. So I don't really see the logic of adding more young Israeli deaths on top of the hostages that they want to get back. It kind of seems like a futile policy. But I was looking at sort of what's playing out, in the rest of the sort of Israeli conflict. And there was a lot of interesting developments that have come through that don't really inspire you to think that there's any going to change happen. Like one of them was that Israel is buying more weaponry from the US, which is probably likely to be approved, and a lot of it is in the aviation area, which they used in the 12-day war against Iran in June, which seems like a long time ago at this stage. And then also you look at the settlement plan for the West Bank, like that's ramping up. And if you also look as well, like last week when I was on, I was talking about how I think a lot of it is to do with domestic Israeli policy and having to ramp up the rhetoric to appeal to the coalition partners. And even if you look at the Israeli finance minister said that the Palestinian state is being erased from the table, that doesn't really sound like, you know, a positive move. And then when you put on top of that, if you look at the International Criminal Court, which again has been quite hard on Israel, that the Trump administration has imposed sanctions on some judges. So when you put all of that on the table, it doesn't look particularly positive, and it doesn't really look like there's going to be any sort of positive outcome to the Gaza conflict anytime soon.
And I think it'll be an escalation, because we've heard the families of the victims, as you rightly said before, say that as soon as troops go into Gaza on the ground, there is no doubt in any of the families' minds that the remaining 20 alive hostages will be sacrificed. And it seemed at some stage that Netanyahu was willing to let that be the case, sacrifice for the greater good, that Hamas would be eradicated. But from people, and this is from families who've said they've had family members who've been in the bunkers, who've been there, they've witnessed firsthand what those hostages are being killed for, the even indication that troops are on the ground will be the first sign of a gun to their heads.
And what's really interesting is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office has actually come out and made a statement today, because the timeline has been unclear for this Gaza City military offensive to happen. But we are obviously seeing reports that troops are now building up on the outskirts of the area they're looking to move into. But Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has ordered a reduction in timelines for taking control of Hamas strongholds and defeating the militant group, which I think, once again, a clear indication here that there doesn't appear to be any will to want to stop this offensive from happening.
No.
Friday is the deadline when he'll give a reply to if he's going to accept the ceasefire proposal or not. But while we're talking about all of this, you know, we're talking about lives of young Israeli reservists going to carry out this military operation, but also lives of people within Gaza and within Gaza City.
Yeah.
And it's like the uncertainty for all of those people.
Well, and we know the UN and the NGO have both said that if there's an on-ground offensive in Gaza, that the death toll will climb even, and we know that that will be the case. But it's also the humanitarian impact that we face as a result of this as well. Things are already, bad is not the word. There is no real word to describe how bad things are on the ground. So it will move it to a next level whereby it may be unsalvageable in that case. And you have to question where is the Israeli stance? Where will they stop and say, right, enough is enough? Is this just a threat? And is that what the idea is here, to get Hamas, because that's the end game, is to get Hamas to throw surrender up and then say we're done? Or are we going to continue until there is, and as you mentioned, Shane, there is the eradication of the Palestinian state?
I don't know if you agree with this, Shane, but I'm not sure if this is a threat, because I think Benjamin Netanyahu is trying to keep his place in power at the top of the table in Israel. And we know you mentioned Smotrich earlier, far-right finance minister. We've also got Ben Gvir, far-right part of the coalition. Netanyahu's got a lot of camps to please when it comes to his political survival.
Yeah, completely. Like the rest of, the full quote was that, the Palestinian state is being erased from the table, not with slogans, but with actions. So that's basically saying this, we're going to do this. And you were saying earlier about, in terms of like the ceasefire, the 60-day truce was obviously, the hostages to be released. They were wanting some Palestinian prisoners then to be released on the other side, and then to allow the aid in. And none of those three things are going to happen. So the ceasefire doesn't look like it's going to happen. So the settlements in the West Bank look like they're pushing ahead sort of quite rapidly, and is part of the sort of keeping the coalition together. So I think these deadlines are going to pass, and Gaza's just going to get worse, I think.
And it's interesting when we talk about the West Bank, because a lot of the mentality behind that is so Palestine can't be recognised as a state. So there's a lot of talk about what is happening, and it is a difficult situation to get our heads around. But thank you so much for your thoughts on that story. Stay right there as we move on to another one now. And Russia's top diplomat, Sergei Lavrov, says discussing Ukraine's security without Moscow is a road to nowhere. His comments come as members of the EU Commission meet today after this week's White House talks between President Trump, Zelensky and European leaders. So once again, we're having a lot happening when it comes to the situation in Ukraine and Russia. I feel like, Shane, there's been a lot of talks, which we know is quite common, but Moscow seems to have really hit back at the White House meeting today, haven't they?
Yeah, they do seem quite annoyed that the sort of, Putin came to Alaska. There was all the fanfare of that, and then just quite quickly afterwards, the Europeans sort of flowed in and kind of like took away sort of the agenda. But I do find it sort of strange, like you were saying, that Russia was saying that having them not being involved in the security of Ukraine is the road to nowhere, and they were saying that they would be in favor of truly reliable guarantees for Ukraine. Just sounds bizarre. This is like a country that's invaded another one, and they want to be involved in the future security of the country going forward. That just doesn't really make any sense to me. And I was trying to think of some sort of an analogy on it, but I'm not sure, because it's a family show. I can go down that road, but so I'll keep it to myself. But it just seems like a bizarre, like, why Moscow is so upset about this, and also why they're upset about that they should be involved in the future security. Like, I think that's down to sort of the US and Europe to police that, make sure that Moscow, once there's a peace deal, they adhere to whatever territorial boundaries are put in place, and by both sides, because they both have to adhere to it. I don't think Russia should be involved in saying whether they can join NATO or what security they can have or the size of their army. So I don't really buy into why they are annoyed, but obviously they are.
Well, I think it's Putin, isn't it? He is the definition of, when he rules with an iron fist.
Yeah, a gangster.
The last thing he wants is to relinquish any land, first and foremost, that he's already spent so much time and effort to try and get his hands on, and second of all, any power over what he sees as extra Russia, which is Ukraine. And I think seeing anything like that, he may be concerned that troops on the force, on the battlefield, and perhaps even at the borders between Ukraine and Russia, may be causing some sort of a threat towards Russia. I can see where he's concerned, but I also see somebody who hates not having control. And for one moment, he felt like he might have been left out of it. And even if they don't attend and go to the table, he still wants to know what's happening.
Yeah, and it didn't seem like there was much really came out of Alaska, other than a lot of sort of body language analysis that seems quite obvious. But if even like in the last sort of 24 hours, when you've seen like Poland's defense minister come out and make concerns about that Russia was provoking sort of NATO borders and drones and stuff, which I don't know if that's been verified, but it's been on Reuters. And then also that Russia's been making advances into extra territory in Ukraine. So this doesn't really sound like a country that is worried about the security of Ukraine or the wider NATO community.
But I think from Russia's point of view, when it comes to security guarantees, this has been the main sticking point, hasn't it, in all of these discussions we've seen. And it's been one of the key points, because it's what will these security guarantees look like? And for Russia, NATO on its borders was the reason that they went into Ukraine from the Russian point of view. So that is probably what Russia is going to desperately try to make sure doesn't happen, because that's something they're determined to not happen. And I think it's quite interesting, because Japan and Sweden have come out today and actually said they might help Ukraine with security guarantees. Lithuania said they could contribute troops. But it's still so unclear what is actually going to happen. And I thought what was interesting is at the Alaska meeting, Donald Trump seemed to leave there saying that it's now going to peace. We're going to get peace. He sort of forgot the idea of a ceasefire. But now all of a sudden the ceasefire is back on the table, and peace is, forever peace is not so in the mind's eye. And I don't know, Jono, if there's been a change in tone and the EU is really pushing for a ceasefire so the fighting stops now, because we see this continuous bombardment of Ukraine.
And I think a ceasefire is the first step we need to get to, because if we don't get to that, I think peace is a very long way from where we are currently. And again, we've had another day today with the UK slapping brand new sanctions on Russia as well to try and in somewhat counteract this, but Moscow immediately just retaliate once again. So the ceasefire, I think, is going to be the step one, and then step two will be the redrawing of, and let's face it, the redrawing of the map, because that's what's going to have to happen here. Then we can get to conversations, and I think that's a really good point. I think Japan or a neutral country or Sweden to go and police the border is likely something that's going to happen. How close are we to that? I really don't think this side of 6 or 7 months. Not this side of Christmas, I don't think, before we see something like that happening. So yeah, I think the road to peace was probably used by Trump loosely to say we're on to...
Yeah, and there's very little detail about how that just sounds like something that you can talk about in the future, in the same way people talk about climate change. Or
but that's a Trumpism.
In the future. Yeah,
that's 24 hours we'll have it done.
Yeah.
That's leaving a meeting and saying this meeting was successful, peace is on the cards.
But we're not going to tell you how or why.
We don't know when,
anyway,
we don't know why, we don't know how it's going to happen, but we know it's on the cards. And I think it is, but it's just, we're definitely not there yet, nor are we any further along from where we were this time last week, or even pre-Alaska, realistically.
And I think a lot of us, and we're having this discussion right now, and every time I think about it and I talk about it to you guys and I interview people, I always think I've got way more questions than answers at this stage. But Shane, I want to speak to you about sanctions, because Russia is currently the most sanctioned country in the world. And, you know, are sanctions just symbolic, or they actually have an impact?
They do in some respects. So I look back then. So it's been 2.5 years since the war in Ukraine started and the sanctions were implemented, and there was billions frozen around the world immediately. So it did have an immediate impact. But in those 2.5 years since we moved on, the GDP of Russia had started to recover purely because the war economy and building towards that and investing in that. But then at the same time, the flip side of that is you've got like 40% of the economy is going towards defense. So that's going to drain the resources. And then if you look at sort of the main driver of Russia is oil and gas, which is obviously a lot of the European countries sort of cut off that supply, but then that switched over to China and India. So I think, and then again, we had what was called the shadow economy and the rise of the ruble in crypto. So I think sanctions are one thing, but I don't think it's going to be the full story. I think you need to look at oil, and I saw one of your clips earlier. I think it was with the U.S. ambassador, former U.S. ambassador, who was speaking about how you need to clamp down and put sanctions on the customers of Russian oil. And I think that's probably a better tactic, because you want them to move away, and you're cutting off their main supply source.
But Donald Trump was given that option, wasn't he?
Yeah.
And we saw that deadline came and went on that Friday a couple of weeks ago. And when Steve Witkoff travelled to Moscow, instead of sanctions being put on, the Alaska summit was arranged.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's been threats of sanctions, but nothing's actually come to light with them.
No, or the other option is the shadow economy, as they're calling it, which is, about 50 billion in terms of Russian transactions, which is basically crypto. But then again, the US president is the crypto president, so I don't think he's going to sort of clamp down on that. But even just today, when I looked up at Reuters, Putin is looking at having to raise taxes and also trim expenditure, because he's got about a $60 billion budget deficit. And even when you look at, the head of the upper house was saying that they've got pessimistic estimates. So you could say maybe economics and it's just business and numbers may be a major factor in determining whether Ukraine...
And how long he can continue, because Putin is spending, there's so much money being spent on this, and I think the latest figures were $211 billion US that's been spent by Russia on this war. And you have to think, with the sanctions that are in place, and yes, they'll always navigate sanctions. Russia are tremendously good at being resourceful when they have been slapped with sanctions for many, many years. They will still persevere. But when it comes to a spend, and that's a real hard figure, 211 billion is not small change for any economy, and certainly for the Russian economy. You have to question how long it can continue before someone has to pull the plug in Russia and say, enough is enough, we've spent enough on this war.
And in terms of sort of China and India, they're the determining factors in the terms of buying oil. there's a lot of levers that the Washington sort of administration has been shown that they can use in terms of the tariffs. And then I think in terms of Ukraine and getting funding, if the war keeps going on, obviously Europe is going to have to step up because, like you said, it's on their borders and NATO is the issue.
But the interesting thing is the US, when it comes to spending on defence for Ukraine, have come out and said that we're not giving them weapons anymore. They're paying us for them because, remember, they struck the minerals deal with Zelensky. So that would be Donald Trump's counter-argument. But it's an absolutely fascinating situation because we talk about the economic impact, but it's also the human impact that Russia has felt. I think it's over 1 million men have died. Yes, the economy is struggling, but I think Russia itself, too, is probably fatigued by the war equally.
And also, if Putin starts to put up taxes, no one's going to like that in Moscow.
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see exactly what happens. And thanks for your thoughts on that. Let's move on now. And the Trump administration has announced plans for a new ICE detention facility in Nebraska that's set to hold 280 undocumented migrants. The facility will be dubbed the Cornhusker Clink, a play on Nebraska's nickname of the Cornhusker State and an old slang term for jail. Jono, the clink. We all know what the clink is.
Yeah. I didn't know that Nebraska was the Cornhusker State until today.
Well, there we are. I know.
280 new beds are going into this. So on the grand scheme of things, this is quite small. Alligator Alcatraz was bigger by comparison, but not a lot bigger. What we know about it, we just know that it is going to be the detention centre whereby they will hold some of the many, many thousands of people, I'll go into that in a second, that have been detained in Nebraska while they're awaiting for their trial to find out if they're going to be legally permitted to live in the United States or they're going to join the illegal immigrants who are leaving the country. Approximately 150,000 in Nebraska alone. Now when you take it and put it into the equation, it doesn't seem like a lot because you've got 288 beds. So you can figure out the math on that. It's going to take a long time to get through all of that. If you look at the US in its entirety, 46 million immigrants. Of that, it's estimated that around approximately 10 or 12 million of them are illegally staying in the country. So they have to be processed and they have to be removed from the country. And you might think, how long is that going to take at the current level of ICE detention centres that they have? And even with the 200% increase planned for Nebraska in the next, they reckon 6 to 7 weeks, it might be a little bit more. It's still going to take 50 years at the current processing time that we're seeing in order to get through these legal immigrants and to find out if they actually are being permitted or have to be deported. So this is one of the big campaign trail mentions that we had, and it was a rhetoric that we had from the Trump administration that he was going to work on immigration. It seems like the feat is going to be almost impossible in this administration and maybe even in this lifetime for a lot of people who are alive right now. 50 years is certainly a long time. Daily arrests are up from 1,000 to 3,000. That's based upon January of this year. So yes, there are more ICE agents. They are potentially getting more people behind bars. But what we've seen is a massive difference and massive sway in 2 or 3 separate things. One of those things is the number of people who've been arrested who are not actually convicts or criminals. And that has gone from where it was up to 70%, which is a sharp rise in that. And we're seeing a lot more people who are being detained with 3 million on the backlog now to have their case heard in front of a court. So it's not working quite according to plan. And I don't think on the scale that we're seeing here that we're going to achieve that.
But like you said, it's something so difficult to achieve in reality. And I think that maybe Trump wildly underestimated how hard it would be. But these centres are, Shane, so divisive, and critics are saying a lot at the moment. So what do they have to say about this?
It's America, so it's divisive. Everything's going to be divisive. Democrats, Republicans. But this is particularly divisive, and it's not surprising because it's this topic. So the supporters have said that these facilities are going to detain the worst of the worst and ensure homeland security. Which, the thousands that you mentioned that there's 280. So I think that there's probably some legitimacy in that. 280 worst will end up in what was it again?
Cornhusker clink.
Yeah, but then, so on the flip side of it, then you've got the Democrat side, and they were saying that it's morally and legally unacceptable what's happening, and that there's no due process, and also it's going to target hard-working families. So on one side, you've got hard-working families, and on the other side, you've got the worst of the worst. So I think probably the reality is probably somewhere in the middle. But I kind of looked at some of the other centres, and I do like the way these things sort of end up with alliteration. And there's Alligator, Alcatraz, Deportation Depot, and I think the other one is Speedway Slammer. So I think you can sort of tweet in what you think the other ones are going to be. But there was one in particular, Fort Bliss, it was called, and I think that had legitimate sort of concerns over the bidding process, and there's a lot of investigations going into that, and who's getting what money and who's winning what sort of contracts. So I think there is legitimate concerns over these facilities, but also as well, when you look at it, 280, it just doesn't seem that many, really.
No, and I think obviously there's an issue with prisons. We can't put these illegal immigrants in prisons and continue to do that, which also is a privatised company across most of the US. So you have to look, somebody's profiteering somewhere along here.
Yeah.
The cost for each one of these prisoners to go into, detainees would be the correct terminology, but they are prisoners. To go into one of these centres is $10,000 minimum. That's a minimum. That's what's going to cost to have them in there for any period of time whatsoever past 5 weeks. That is your turnaround time. It's 5 weeks from when they enter the door to when they leave. So it's going to take a very, very long time. But at the same time, this is what the public wanted. This is what people voted for.
Yeah. And that's what I was going to say to you. You know, we just have to look at, obviously, there's massive supporters of this who got Donald Trump into power on his fact he was going to make the city safer, he was going to make America great again, he was going to bring more jobs, he was going to stop, you know, the illegal aliens coming from Mexico. That's what he spoke about, you know, build the wall. We heard that so much in his first term.
Yeah, it was just feeding into people's sort of fears, and it worked, because, you know, he won. And I'm inclined to believe, in some respects of it, you know, the worst of the worst, there should be just better, you know, administration and analysis.
But I do think one thing, I just think we look at the UK right now, and we look at the migration scene in the UK, and they have been housing people in hotels.
Yeah, at $25,000 a year.
Exactly. So. At more money. You know, it's been causing outrage within the local towns because people have felt unsafe.
Yeah.
You know, these people haven't been documented. There's been a lot of unrest over that. So if we look in comparison to what's actually happening in England at the moment, where now the courts have got involved in it because it's been so divisive, maybe America are doing it right.
Well, they seem to be able to do it a lot quicker. It could be just a case of they've got more spare land going around, and they don't have as much planning regulations, which seems to stop everything in the UK and Ireland these days anyway. But and they do seem like fairly temporary buildings that can sort of be pushed up pretty quickly. So I think yes, the US seems to be taking this a lot more stringently, and it seems to be stuck down in a lot of sort of regulation in the UK, which is surprising because they're both, you know, Brexit was built on this issue. So you would think that the UK would have a lot more time to have dealt with this problem and come up with a solution. So
but
I think
it's still
the US,
a disaster.
And which I think is when you see Democrats saying this is not humane, this is not the right thing to do, this is not correct. Everyone seems to have a criticism on what this current solution is, but nobody seems to have the alternative solution for what will actually work. And if this administration are doing anything, they're at least trying to stick by the word, which is what they said. We will work on deporting illegal immigrants. Okay, it's a slow process, but at least they've kicked the process off, which is more that can be said for, I think, in a lot of countries in Europe would
and then I think when the midterm elections come around, then that'll be another time to renew the mandate.
Absolutely.
And people will decide whether the Trump administration has done enough, or whether how they feel on the situation. So we'll get another indication of where the lay of the land is.
Thank you so much for your thoughts on that. And let's move on to another story now. And the White House has launched an official TikTok account, taking advantage of the app's 170 million US users. Its first video shows footage of Trump as he declares, "I'm your voice." We'll take a look.
Every day, I wake up determined to deliver a better life for the people all across this nation. I am your voice.
So, reaction, you haven't seen it,
No,
Shane?
I didn't watch it. I wanted to watch it live. It's surprisingly classy, I have to say. Like, for a man who generally likes a bit of YMCA and, you know, even in Saudi Arabia, I'm quite surprised. I was expecting something a lot cheesier.
It looks great, doesn't it?
Like you said, it's a bit JFK going on.
It does feel like there's a JFK
Yeah.
vibe, but this is just
Yeah.
a taster. I think we'll get.
Yeah.
This is his initial. You have to give it some time. He'll build.
Yeah, because I'll admit, earlier I said I don't think TikTok's befitting the White House, but actually I've changed my mind. That is pretty good.
It was
That
good.
was really good.
It was really
Yeah,
slick and
yeah.
well produced, I actually thought. And
Yeah,
the tagline to it, in case anyone wants to follow the account, it's "Welcome to the Golden Age of America."
Wow.
There we are.
Mouthful.
I am your voice, Jono.
Once this, I think there's a young audience that Trump is trying to tap into. He may find it difficult to reach through the narrative of whatever social media they're being pushed currently, because there may be an agenda for the social media or the media that they're consuming. And I think this is a way for people who are your hardcore MAGA supporters or people who are an audience that's untapped to be able to experience a bit of inside Donald Trump. And I don't think we're going to get too much of, I would like to think we're not going to get too much of White House content. I want to see more Trump content, because I think that's probably far more entertaining. If I want official White House content, I'll jump on X. But if I want Trump content, maybe I want to go and look on Twitter.
Do you think we'll get that, because we spoke about it earlier, do you think that we'll get the get ready with Donald Trump? You know, him doing his hair, maybe a bit of bronzer in the morning before he heads out, what products he uses. I would love to know that, you know, what's his morning sort of routine? What aftershave does he use? You know, toothpaste.
Probably because some of the other social media posts that they put out have been fairly cringe and sort of low key. And I think, like I said, I don't want to keep going back to it. It was quite a classy video. And I think, you know, I think what they could do is bring the First Lady onto it and sort of humanize her a bit more by putting her on TikTok.
I love Melania.
I think it could be a better medium for her to become more amenable to sort of like the Democrat side of it, or even the Republican ones, because I think that would be a nice insight into it.
But we can't forget one thing, Jono. The TikTok ban has been spoken about so much in the US. Donald Trump has delayed the ban coming in. And I spoke to our reporter, Nick Harper, earlier, who made a point that there's actually been a lot of hate about this White House account starting up, because influencers have been so concerned that their platform in the US is going to be removed from them, how they make all their money. And he said, you know, some people are saying, and Donald Trump's just realised, he's probably the most hated man on TikTok for that reason.
Well, I think, look, being in seriousness about it, you have to look at what is TikTok, where has TikTok come from, and what are the security concerns that may be at play behind this as well. And lawmakers in Washington have already said TikTok is owned by ByteDance, and Donald Trump and ByteDance have had this back and forth love-hate relationship where you're never really sure where he stands at what given week as regards to the upcoming ban, if it's happening or not. There is still data protection concerns, which are in there, which will now be shared with the Chinese company, which on the surface of it, I think I can see the benefit of Donald Trump himself having an account, but the White House having an account as an official terms is a little bit of a trick. It's a security concern that is being shared across the White House by a lot of people. Republicans, Democrats have said this.
For an administration that accidentally lets journalists into WhatsApp groups about warfare, I think...
But we've
Signal
seen,
Group. Do you remember Signal Group Gate? Yeah.
And we've seen it with Signal, we've seen it across a lot of different platforms.
Yeah.
I would be concerned that we're perhaps running the risk, and I don't know what personal data TikTok keeps on each one of their 170 million US users, so you have to worry if that perhaps is a security concern. Does the White House necessarily need to be there? What next? They jump on Snapchat and they have an account on there. Donald Trump, yes, I can see the benefit as a person, as a character, that makes sense. As POTUS, not necessarily something needs to be up there.
Yeah, I kind of agree. Like, yeah, Donald Trump can be on there fine, but yeah, I don't know if the White House needs to be on. You kind of think, where's it going to go?
And I think that's what people want.
There? Yeah.
I think people want those videos that are Trump videos.
And I also think, though, that people within the White House have become quite big characters within themselves, because one of the posts from today was Caroline Leavitt, the press secretary, and she's become a sort of cult figure in her own right.
Yeah.
You know, we see her standing up.
She's going to be massive when she finishes.
She's going to be... She's huge, you know, and you've got to think about that. Pete Hegseth, Marco Rubio.
J.D. Vance needs 2 accounts.
You know what I'm saying?
His personalities.
I just want to say I can't believe the White House beat me onto TikTok. Anyway, they're there
What
now.
I was surprised was that when it showed the figures, it was at 52 minutes on average, US users. 52 minutes seems really low to me. And then even the other ones, like the other ones were about 30 minutes. So some of the stats where I looked at when they compared them, you know, like I spend longer than that on MySpace every day.
Well, back in the day, MySpace doesn't exist anymore. we all had that one. But yeah, that's why I don't have TikTok, because I would spend 55 minutes on it a day, because I know once you get into a cat video...
It's a rabbit hole, yeah.
Yeah, that's it, you're watching them all. But, and finally, John O'Hays and Shane McGinley have come up with a couple of fabulous, quirky stories of the day, so they've done their homework for me. And Shane, yours is about McDonald's cutting its combo meal prices. Ooh, why?
Well, yeah, I guess... You know, there's, like we were saying earlier, there's not many countries where there's not McDonald's. There's not many people that haven't had a McDonald's. And I personally absolutely love McDonald's. And just to be balanced, I do prefer Burger King chips. So, but, you know, you can't have everything. But maybe. So, yeah, they have cut the price of the combo meals, which is basically when you get a Big Mac or a chicken nuggets, which I know you're a favourite.
Do you still get a toy in the meal?
Happy Meal. That's
for Happy Meal. But it's frowned upon when you're an adult. That's okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. And you get the drink. So it's the combo meal that you get, which is going to be 15% cheaper than the individual items. And I think the reason they're doing this, and the very wise spokesperson said, is because customers are telling us, that's at McDonald's, that they need more of everyday value and affordability, which, you know, shock horror, who would have thought that?
So psychologically, though, so what does the combo meal cost now around?
So it varies considerably between what American city or whether you're in rural, and also the franchise set their price. But they've come to an agreement collectively. But they did have an interesting point in the Wall Street Journal article, because they're the ones who broke it this morning, actually, that $10 is the psychological mark where if it's even a couple of cents over, that's seen as a bit of expensive. So don't be surprised if we're seeing a lot of like $9.98 sort of Big Mac meals going around. But I think it's obviously indicative of McDonald's wants to rein back, because it hadn't had an easy time of it. The number of visits to their restaurants was down only about 2%, but when you think of the growth that they had before, and it definitely seems to be working. Like their stock price is better. They're moving back into, you know, profitable growth, and the number of stores is going up. So definitely this policy is working, and I think something like McDonald's, you have a sort of psychological price where you expect it to be quite low. Like, do you remember at one point they started going into cafes and trying to go upmarket?
Can I tell you something? I must admit, I'm one of those very few people that doesn't eat in McDonald's. I'm sorry about that, but...
You're doing your body a favour, which is a temple. But the Big Mac Index, and we haven't heard about that in quite a while. The Big Mac
it used to be
Index
absolutely massive, the Big Mac Index,
and still is. If you look at places like Switzerland, you're on $6.71. And then if you look at places like Taiwan, it's 2.39, and it gives you a good indication for where everything should be. So I would say that a drop in the price of maybe a meal deal potentially could be the sign of some sort of a global decline overall financially. And
maybe,
you're the financial expert.
It went up 27% since 2019, so there had been a massive sort of increase. And I think it is just around that psychological sort of $10 price.
Yeah, I know. I'd rather pay $1.99.
Like, I'll be over to Dubai Media City tomorrow checking if the prices have gone down.
Fact-finding mission.
All right, but I just want to get on to Jono's story, because I'm being told that we've got absolutely no time left, and, you know, the Big Mac Index can wait maybe for another day. But, Jono, you've got a story about a breathtaking world record for us. No pun intended there.
Amazing. Croatian freediver Vitimir Merisic has just set the new Guinness World Record, actually beat the old freestyle breath-holding record by a whopping 5 minutes, which is no mean feat. Underwater, he stayed there longer than a bottlenose dolphin on their longest dive, or a harbour seal, which can actually do a long dive as well, and was underwater for 29 minutes
Wow.
and 3 seconds, which is incredible.
Incredible.
So well done to him. I mean, what a Guinness World Record. I don't think anyone's going to come close to that without years and years of practice. So that's an incredible feat.
Gosh, I just think that's phenomenal. And do you know what else? It's also just keeping calm in that situation, you know, because they have to do so much breath work and expand their lungs while they're underwater. The training involved in a free dive is phenomenal. And then this guy's almost like sort of superhuman.
30 minutes,
Well, do you
crazy.
remember Tom Cruise trained for it for a long time, and he held, I think, like probably the celebrity record. So I think when he sees that, you're just stoking the beast that he's going to go. And
The Tom Cruise was going to try and beat the
that,
record.
yeah.
Why not?
Mission Impossible 15. Here we come.
Oh no, I can't deal with another Mission Impossible from Tom Cruise. I'm sorry. If that story ever happens, we're not covering it. And thanks to today's guest, Dubai 92 presenter John O'Hayes and business editor of Gulf Arabian Business Insight, Shane McGinley. And that's all from us on W News Extra. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and, of course, follow us on X. G&T with Tom Burgess-Watson will be coming up next. Goodbye and thank you for joining us.